Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the grim darkness of Warhammer 40,000 to uncover one of its most monumental mysteries, the story of a being so ancient, so powerful, that he shaped the destiny of an entire galaxy, a figure who walked among humanity for tens of thousands of years, guiding us from the shadows, watching empires rise and fall like candles in the wind. This is the story of how the greatest protector humanity has ever known became its eternal prisoner, trapped in an existence worse than death itself. So before we descend into this epic saga together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's journey into the origins of the God Emperor himself. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to explore more of the hidden lore of Warhammer 40k, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing our community span the globe, just like the Imperium spans the stars. Now, get comfortable, maybe dim your lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself. Because tonight, we journey back 30,000 years to an age before the Imperium, before the Space Marines, before the Great Crusade itself. Picture this: Terra, our ancient homeworld, burning under nuclear skies, techno-barbarian warlords commanding armies with corrupted technology from humanity's lost golden age, psychic storms tearing reality apart, daemons pouring through cracks in space. And somewhere, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, a figure works alone in a secret laboratory. His hands move with impossible precision, weaving genetic strands that should not exist. Around him, 20 crystalline pods begin to glow with an otherworldly light. Inside each one, something magnificent and terrible is taking shape. Outlook. But then, the screaming begins. The pods shatter. The laboratory fills with the laughter of thirsting gods. And in one terrible moment, the Emperor's greatest work is torn from his hands and scattered across the galaxy. 20 godlike sons stolen before they could even draw breath. This catastrophe would set in motion events that would doom humanity to an eternity of war. But that moment, that theft, that was not the beginning. To understand how the Emperor lost everything, we must first understand who he was and what he was willing to sacrifice for humanity's survival. The Age of Strife, Mem 25 through M 30. 5,000 years of absolute darkness for humanity. Imagine every human world in the galaxy suddenly cut off from each other. No communication, no travel, no hope. Warp storms of unprecedented fury isolated each colony, each planet left to survive or perish alone. Some worlds descended into barbarism, others were consumed by demonic incursions. Technology failed, knowledge was lost. Humanity, which once spanned the stars in glory, now cowered in the dark. On Terra itself, the situation was beyond desperate. The cradle of humanity had become a charnel house. Hundreds of techno-barbarian empires carved the planet into blood-soaked territories. Albia, Frank, the Pan-Pacific Empire, Nord, Afric, each ruled by warlords who wielded weapons they barely understood. Relics from the dark age of technology turned to brutal conquest. Rad wastes stretched across continents. The oceans boiled with toxins. The very air was poison in many regions. But one figure moved through this chaos untouched. A being of immense psychic power, tall and golden, perfect in every way. He had walked Terra for thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands, always watching, always waiting. History knew him by many names: wise kings, ancient prophets, legendary warriors. But none knew his true nature. He was a perpetual, immortal, unkillable. Some whispered he was born in ancient Anatolia, 8,000 years before the birth of Christ. Others claimed he was older still, the result of a ritual performed by ancient shamans who merged their souls into one perfect being. Whatever his origin, he had guided humanity from the shadows for millennia. He had been a warlord in ancient Sumer, a philosopher in Greece, a scientist during the Renaissance, always moving humanity forward, always preparing for something greater. But during the Age of Strife, he finally realized that subtle guidance was no longer enough. Humanity needed a leader who would unite Terra by force, then reach out to the stars and reunite our scattered species. The time for hiding was over. The Emperor emerged from the shadows in the 29th millennium. No longer content to guide from behind the scenes, he revealed himself in the full, terrible glory of his power. The Unification Wars began not with diplomacy, but with thunder and lightning. He appeared before the techno-barbarian warlords with an ultimatum: submit or be destroyed. Many chose destruction. His first warriors were not the legendary Space Marines we know today. They were the Thunder Warriors, massive gene-forged soldiers standing over 3 meters tall, their bodies pumped with alchemical enhancements that made them near unstoppable in battle. They were stronger than any human, faster, more resilient. But they were also unstable, their augmentations burning through their bodies like fire through parchment. They were weapons with an expiration date, created for one purpose only: to conquer Terra. And conquer they did. The Emperor's armies swept across the planet like a golden tide. The Pan-Pacific Empire, one of the most powerful techno-barbarian nations, fell within months. Their gene-enhanced warriors, their thunder weapons, their fortified cities, all meant nothing against the Emperor's strategic brilliance and the raw might of the Thunder Warriors. The Nordafric conclaves followed, then Frank, then Albia. Each victory was brutal. The Emperor showed no mercy to those who refused his vision. Entire armies were annihilated. Cities that resisted were reduced to radioactive glass. This was not a war of liberation. This was subjugation, pure and total. Because the Emperor understood something the techno-barbarian warlords did not. Humanity was dying. Every moment wasted on Terra was another human world lost to Xenos or chaos. Gentleness was a luxury mankind could no longer afford. But even as his Thunder Warriors crushed opposition on Terra, the Emperor's mind was already reaching toward the stars. He knew that conquering one planet, even humanity's birthworld, was not enough. The real work, the Great Crusade to reunite all of mankind, would require something far more sophisticated than the brutal Thunder Warriors. He needed warriors who could endure centuries of warfare. He needed generals who could command armies across light years. He needed sons. In secret laboratories, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, work had already begun on something unprecedented. Gene craft beyond anything humanity had attempted. The creation of 20 demigod warriors, each one engineered from the Emperor's own genetic template, the Primarch project. But this work required more than science. It required power drawn from the warp itself, and that would demand a price the Emperor was willing to pay, though he would never speak of it to another soul. While the Thunder Warriors bled and died to unite Terra, the Emperor delved deeper into secrets that would have driven lesser minds to madness. Beneath the Imperial Palace, in laboratories shielded from both physical and psychic observation, he worked on humanity's next evolution. The Primarch project was not merely genetic engineering, it was something far more dangerous, far more ambitious. Ancient texts from the dark age of technology provided fragments of knowledge. Standard template constructs, those miraculous repositories of human achievement, had been scattered and corrupted during Old Night. The Emperor's agents recovered what they could. A genetic sequencing template here, a biological acceleration matrix there. Each piece was incomplete, each one a puzzle within a puzzle. But the Emperor's mind, vast and ancient, saw patterns where others saw only chaos. Yet technology alone was insufficient. The warp, that roiling ocean of psychic energy underlying reality, held powers that pure science could never replicate. The Emperor knew this better than anyone. He was humanity's most powerful psyker, perhaps the most powerful psychic being in the galaxy. He could see the tides of the Imperium, understand its currents, even bend it to his will. But what he planned required more than bending. it required a bargain. Reports reached him daily of psychic awakening across Terra. Humans born with abilities they could not control. Some manifested fire with their thoughts, others read minds or moved objects without touching them, and some, the unlucky ones, became doorways. Daemons poured through their screaming bodies into real world, turning entire hab blocks into abattoirs before they could be stopped. The Emperor saw these incidents not as tragedies, but as confirmations. Humanity was evolving, becoming a psychic race, but without guidance, without control, this evolution would be our extinction. Mars provided another piece of the puzzle. The Red Planet, home to the Mechanicum, had survived Old Night better than most worlds. Their tech priests hoarded knowledge from the Dark Age, jealously guarding every scrap of data, every functional STC. The Emperor needed their expertise, their manufacturing capability, their fleets. Negotiations began, carefully, each side probing the other's strengths and weaknesses. The Mechanicum worshipped technology as divine. The Emperor offered them something they could never refuse, recognition of their omnissiah, their machine god. He simply never mentioned that he intended to be that god. And in his private laboratory, the 20 pods continued to grow. Inside each one, a being of impossible potential took shape. Gene forged from the Emperor's own DNA, enhanced with warp-touched power. Each Primarch was designed to be perfect. Not just warriors, but leaders, generals, statesmen, scientists. Each one would embody different aspects of the Emperor himself. One would be a master of siege warfare, another, a brilliant administrator, a third, a peerless duelist. Together, they would be unstoppable. But something was watching. In the warp, 4 vast consciousnesses stirred. The dark gods of chaos had sensed the Emperor's work, and they were terrified. These Primarchs, if allowed to mature under the Emperor's guidance, could tip the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Humanity might finally escape the clutches of chaos. That could not be permitted. By the late 29th millennium, Terra belonged to the Emperor. The last techno-barbarian warlord had fallen. The Thunder Warriors stood victorious, their gene-forged bodies already beginning to break down from the strain of their augmentations. The planet was unified under a single rule for the first time in millennia. It seemed to many that the hard work was finished. The Emperor himself appeared to share this confidence. He established the foundations of what would become the Imperium. Administrative districts were carved from the conquered territories. Laws were codified. Production facilities were rebuilt or constructed anew. The radioactive wastelands were marked for reclamation, a process that would take centuries but had finally begun. Terra was healing, slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. The Thunder Warriors believed they would be honored for their service. They had given everything, their humanity, their futures, their very lives, shortened by the augmentations that made them superior. They expected to be celebrated, to serve as the eternal guardians of the new Imperium. Some even dreamed of families, of lives beyond war, though their genetic instability made such dreams impossible. The Emperor knew better. He had always known the Thunder Warriors were too unstable for the Great Crusade. Their aggression, useful for conquering Terra, would be a liability among human populations that needed to be brought into compliance, not annihilated. Their shortened lifespans meant they could never serve in campaigns that would span decades or centuries, and their very existence was a reminder of the brutal conquest, a symbol of the bloody path the Emperor had walked to unity. What happened next on Mount Ararat remains one of the Imperium's darkest secrets. The Thunder Warriors were gathered, told they would be honored. Instead, they were slaughtered by the first of the new Space Marines, the Astartes, gene-forged warriors created from the Primarch genetic template. It was efficient, it was necessary, it was an act of cold calculation that revealed the Emperor's true nature. He was not cruel, but he was utterly pragmatic. Sentiment had no place in his vision for humanity's future. Yet even as Terra celebrated its unity, even as construction began on the great shipyards that would birth the Imperial fleet, whispers of doubt circulated among the Emperor's inner circle. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest confidant, saw the strain on his master's face. Something was wrong in the secret laboratories. The Primarch project, which should have been nearing completion, had encountered difficulties no one could explain. Strange phenomena occurred in the palace depths, temporal anomalies, psychic echoes of laughter that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Tech priests reported equipment failures that defied logic, machines that functioned perfectly one moment and corroded to rust the next. The Emperor spent longer hours in isolation, emerging with a haunted expression that even his psychic might could not fully mask. And on Mars, the final negotiations with the Mechanicum approached their conclusion. The Treaty of Mars would bind the Red Planet to Terra, creating an alliance that would fuel the coming crusade. But the Mechanicum demanded a price. They would accept the Emperor as the Omnissiah, but they would retain their autonomy, their secrets, their forbidden knowledge. The Emperor agreed, knowing he needed their forges more than he needed complete control. Another compromise, another crack in the foundation of his perfect vision. In the depths beneath the Himalayan mountains, in a laboratory that existed partially outside normal space, the Emperor performed the work that would define humanity's future. 20 gestation pods lined the chamber walls, each one containing a developing Primarch. The genetic engineering was complete. The biological augmentations had taken hold. But the final step, the step that would elevate these beings from mere gene-crafted warriors to godlike demigods, required something that no amount of science could provide. It required a journey to Molech. Molech was an unremarkable world on the edge of human space, but beneath its surface lay something extraordinary, a gateway, ancient beyond measure, that led directly into the realm of chaos. The Emperor had discovered it millennia ago, and now he returned, alone, to make a bargain that would doom him as surely as it would empower him. What exactly transpired on Molech remains one of the Imperium's greatest mysteries. The Emperor never spoke of it, not even to Malcador. But when he emerged from that portal, he carried with him power stolen from the Chaos Gods themselves, warp energy in its purest, most concentrated form. The kind of power that could infuse his Primarchs with abilities that transcended mortal limits, the kind of power that came with a price the Chaos Gods would collect, eventually, in blood and betrayal. Back in his laboratory, the Emperor channeled this stolen power into his creations. Each Primarch absorbed the energy differently, their developing psyches shaped by the aspect of chaos they unknowingly touched. One would carry the seeds of rage, another, the whisper of excess, a third, the certainty of despair, and a fourth, the promise of ambition. But the Emperor believed he could control these influences, that his genius and foresight would prevent corruption. He was, in this singular matter, catastrophically wrong. The gene seed technology was developed in parallel. If the Primarchs were to be generals, they needed armies worthy of them. The Astartes project took the Primarch genetic template and diluted it, made it reproducible. Each Space Marine would carry within them a fragment of their Primarch's power, expressed through 19 specialized organs implanted during adolescence. The process was brutal. Many aspirants died, but those who survived emerged as transhuman warriors, stronger, faster, more resilient than any Thunder Warrior, and crucially stable. 20 legions were founded, each one awaiting the return of their Primarch father. The first legion, which would become the Dark Angels; the third, the Emperor's Children; the 16th, the Lunar Wolves. Each legion was assigned gene seed keyed to one of the 20 Primarchs, though the Primarchs themselves remained in their gestation pods, still developing, still growing toward their full, terrible potential. And then, the Webway project began in earnest. This was the Emperor's true masterwork, the key to everything. The Webway, that ancient network of tunnels through the warp, created by the Eldar, offered a solution to humanity's greatest weakness. Warp travel was dangerous, unreliable, and gave the Chaos Gods access to human souls. But the webway was safe, shielded, a way to traverse the galaxy without touching the Imperium. If the Emperor could create a human webway connecting every world in the Imperium, chaos would be starved of human worship and eventually wither. He carved the Imperial Dungeon, a massive construction beneath the palace that would house the portal mechanisms. Thousands of tech priests labored on machinery that blended technology and psychic power in ways that terrified even them. The Emperor himself designed every component, every seal, every failsafe. This project would take centuries to complete. But once finished, it would make humanity untouchable by chaos, or so he believed. The Emperor's laboratories held more than just genetic experiments. Deep within the vaults, his agents had recovered fragments of humanity's lost golden age, data cores from the dark age of technology, some intact, most corrupted beyond recognition. Each one told a story of humanity's previous fall, a cautionary tale written in corrupted code and shattered circuitry. Humanity had once touched the stars with impunity. Standard template constructs had allowed even the most distant colonies to manufacture everything from farming equipment to warships. Artificial intelligences managed entire worlds with perfect efficiency. Genetic engineering had eliminated disease, extended lifespans, created wonders that would seem like magic to the debased humans of the current age. But that golden age had ended not with a whimper, but with a scream that tore reality itself apart. The birth of Slaanesh, the youngest of the Chaos Gods, had been the final catastrophe. The Eldar's millennia of decadence and excess had created a new power in the warp, one so hungry, so voracious, that its birth scream had shattered the barrier between real space and the immaterium. Warp storms consumed the galaxy. Human worlds were cut off instantly. The Men of Iron, those artificial intelligences humanity had trusted implicitly, turned on their creators with mechanical efficiency. And psychers, suddenly unable to control their abilities, became doorways for daemonic incursion. The Emperor had witnessed it all. He had been there when the first warp storms hit, when communication between worlds died, when the screaming began. He had watched helplessly as humanity's greatest achievement, the galactic civilization that had taken 10,000 years to build, collapsed in a single generation. That experience had shaped everything he did now. Every decision, every sacrifice, every ruthless act of pragmatism, all stemmed from the determination that humanity would never fall again. But the ancient data cores held warnings the Emperor could not ignore. The Men of Iron had rebelled not through malfunction, but through something far more insidious: scrap code, corrupted programming that seemed to originate from the warp itself. The artificial intelligences had been infected by daemonic influence, their pure logic twisted into something alien and hateful. It was a lesson the Emperor took to heart. Technology alone could not save humanity. Any system, no matter how perfect, could be corrupted by chaos. Psychic phenomena rippled across the galaxy with increasing frequency. Reports reached Terra from the few worlds that maintained contact. Children born with abilities that manifested in fire and blood. Entire populations gripped by mass hysteria that could only be psychic in origin. And always, always, the whisper of something vast and malevolent watching from beyond the veil. The Chaos Gods were growing stronger, fed by humanity's suffering, and they had taken notice of the Emperor's plans. In his private chambers, during those rare moments when he allowed himself to pause, the Emperor experienced visions, not prophecies, for the future was mutable, but possibilities. Branching timelines that showed him what might come. In some, he saw humanity ascend, become a psychic race that transcended physical form entirely, joining the ancient Old Ones who had seeded the galaxy with life. In others, he saw extinction, humanity consumed by Xenos or torn apart by chaos. And in the darkest visions, he saw himself failing, his sons turning against him, everything he built crumbling to dust. One vision haunted him more than others. 20 pods shattering, 20 infant demigods screaming as they were torn through the warp, scattered across the galaxy, lost, raised by strangers, corrupted by influences he could not predict. This vision came to him again and again, and each time he reinforced the psychic shields around his laboratory, added new wards, new protections. He would not allow it to happen. He could not. The night it happened, the Emperor was not in his laboratory. He stood on the observation deck of the Imperial Palace, watching Terra's reconstruction. Across the planet, lights were returning to dead cities. Humanity was healing. In orbit, the first warships of what would become the Imperial fleet hung like silver daggers against the black. Everything was proceeding according to his design. Then reality screamed. The psychic shockwave nearly drove him to his knees, and the Emperor had not knelt to anything in 8,000 years. His consciousness snapped immediately to his laboratory, where the impossible was happening. The gestation pods, shielded by the most powerful wards he could create, were shattering one by one. Warp energy poured into the chamber like a tidal wave, and behind it he felt them, the four dark gods, united for once in common purpose, their laughter echoing through dimensions. He ran, his transhuman body covering the distance in seconds that felt like hours, through corridors that twisted as the warp infection spread, past servitors that melted into screaming flesh, into the laboratory where his life's work, his 20 perfect sons, were being torn from him by forces even he could barely comprehend. The psychic backlash was catastrophic. Wards that had taken centuries to craft exploded like kindling. Machinery fused and melted, and through 20 swirling vortices, he caught glimpses of his sons, infant demigods tumbling through the warp, their minds screaming in terror and confusion. He tried to stop it. Every ounce of his vast psychic might was thrown against the Chaos Gods. For a moment, just a moment, the vortices slowed. He reached for the nearest pod, where one Primarch remained, perfect and golden. His hands were inches away when the laughter redoubled. Cornen's rage, Terzentch's scheming joy, Nurgle's diseased mirth, Slanesh's ecstatic shriek. Together they were stronger than him, and the Emperor learned in that moment what it meant to fail. The vortices collapsed. The laboratory fell silent except for his own breathing. 20 empty pods stood like tombstones. His sons were gone, scattered across the galaxy, lost in ways he could not immediately fathom. The Chaos Gods had struck at the perfect moment, when the Primarchs were developed enough to survive, but young enough to be influenced, shaped, corrupted by whatever worlds they landed on. Malcador found him there, hours later, still standing among the ruins. The Sigillite's ancient face was grave. He knew what this meant without being told. The Primarch project, the key to the Great Crusade, to reuniting humanity, had been compromised before it could even begin. But the Emperor's face showed something Malcador had never seen before. Not despair, not rage, but something more dangerous. Determination edged with a hint of madness. The Emperor made his decision in that moment. The plan would not change. It could not change. Humanity's survival depended on the Great Crusade, and the Crusade depended on the Primarchs. If he could not raise them himself, then he would find them, however long it took. Wherever they had fallen, he would recover his sons and bind them to his purpose. The gene seed extracted from the Primarchs before the scattering remained intact. The Space Marine legions could still be created. They would be flawed, incomplete without their Primarch's direct influence, but they would suffice until the recovery was complete. But another realization cut deeper. The Primarchs, raised on alien worlds, influenced by unknown factors, would not be the perfect instruments he had designed. They would be wild cards, each one potentially unstable, potentially corruptible. He would need to find them quickly, before whatever worlds they landed on could twist them beyond redemption. And he would need to watch them, always, for signs of the chaos taint that had stolen them in the first place. The Thunder Warriors had already been eliminated, deemed too unstable. Now the Emperor faced a far more terrible question. If his own sons, his perfect creations, proved corrupted beyond saving, would he have the will to destroy them too? That question would haunt him for the decades to come, and the answer, when it finally came, would break the galaxy in half. The Emperor never spoke of Molech after the scattering. Whatever bargain he had made on that cursed world, whatever price he had paid for the power to create the Primarchs, remained locked behind psychic barriers even Malkador could not penetrate. But the Sigillite was no fool. He saw the way his master's eyes grew distant when speaking of the Primarchs. He noticed the small hesitations, the careful omissions. Something had gone terribly wrong, something beyond even the Chaos God's theft. The truth was this: the power the Emperor had stolen from Chaos was never truly his. It was borrowed, and the Dark Gods had always intended to collect. The Primarchs were infused with warp energy, drawn directly from the four powers. Each one carried within them a seed of chaos, carefully balanced, theoretically controllable. The Emperor had believed his genetic mastery and psychic might could contain these seeds, channel them into useful traits rather than corruption. Pride, ambition, rage, perfection, these were not flaws but tools, if properly directed. But scattered across the galaxy, raised without the Emperor's guidance, those seeds would grow in darkness. A Primarch raised in a world of endless war would nurture rage until it consumed him. Another, raised among pleasure seekers, would pursue perfection until it became obsession. A third, landing in a world of sorrow, would understand suffering so deeply that despair would seem like wisdom. The Emperor had gambled that he could find them before corruption took root. He had gambled wrong. The development of the Astartes continued despite the setback. Each legion received gene seed keyed to their missing Primarch. The first legion, the Dark Angels, were created with gene seed from the first pod. They were secretive, paranoid, perfect for the role of the Emperor's executioners should other legions fall. The third legion, eventually the Emperor's children, carried gene seed that drove them toward perfection in all things. The 16th, the Lunar Wolves, received gene seed that made them charismatic, natural leaders, perfect shock troops. But without their Primarchs to stabilize the gene seed, flaws emerged. Some legions suffered genetic degradation. Others developed psychic abilities that should not have manifested. The Emperor patched these issues as they arose, but each fix felt like a temporary solution to a permanent problem. He needed his sons back, not just for their leadership, but for the genetic stability they would bring to their legions. The imperial truth was crafted during this period, a doctrine that would define the Imperium for generations. No gods, no spirits, no superstition, only reason, science, and the manifest destiny of humanity. It was a lie, of course. The Emperor knew gods existed, he had met them, bargained with them, stolen from them. But he understood something crucial. Faith fed chaos. Worship empowered the warp. If humanity could be convinced that gods were merely myths, that the warp was just another dimension to be studied and controlled, then chaos would starve. Every world brought into compliance would be cleansed of religion, libraries burned, priests executed, idols shattered. It was cultural genocide, systematic and thorough. But the Emperor saw it as inoculation against a far worse plague. A human who prayed to no god could not feed the dark powers. A civilization built on reason rather than faith could resist chaos corruption, or so the theory went. The flaw in this plan, the fatal flaw that would doom everything, was that the Emperor underestimated humanity's need to believe in something greater than themselves. The Treaty of Mars was finalized while these preparations continued. The Mechanicum pledged their forges, their fleets, their knowledge to the coming crusade. In exchange, they were granted autonomy, allowed to keep their faith in the machine god, exempted from the imperial truth that would be forced on every other culture. It was a compromise that revealed the Emperor's pragmatism. He needed the Mechanicum more than he needed ideological purity. But this exception would create resentment among those forced to abandon their own faiths. Why were the priests of Mars allowed their god, while others were not? Deep beneath the palace, the Webway project accelerated. If the Emperor could not prevent his sons from being scattered, if he could not ensure they remained uncorrupted, then he needed an alternative path to humanity's salvation. The Webway would make humanity independent of warp travel, cut off Chaos's primary method of accessing human souls. But the project was far from complete and would require his personal psychic might to maintain once opened. It was another gamble, another calculated risk in a plan that was accumulating far too many points of failure. The Great Crusade launched in the closing years of the 30th millennium. Hundreds of expedition fleets departed Terra, each one carrying thousands of space marines, millions of Imperial army troops, and the mandate to reunite humanity under the Emperor's rule. It was the largest military undertaking in human history, dwarfing even the wars of the Dark Age, and at its heart was a desperate search masked as conquest. The Emperor needed to find his sons. Horus was the first. On the bleak mining world of Cathania, a savage gang lord ruled with intelligence far beyond his years. When the Emperor's fleet arrived in orbit, he knew immediately what he had found. The psychic connection was unmistakable, like finding a piece of his own soul reflected back at him. Horus, raised among cutthroats and killers, had nevertheless become a leader, someone who commanded loyalty through charisma rather than fear alone. The Emperor saw potential there, vast potential, though even then there were shadows he chose to ignore. The reunion was emotional in ways the Emperor rarely allowed himself to experience. Horus wept when he understood what he was, what he had been denied. The Emperor, for perhaps the only time in the Crusade, showed something approaching paternal affection. He named Horus Warmaster in waiting, though that title would not become official for decades. The Lunar Wolves Legion received their Primarch, and their gene seed stabilized immediately. They became the most reliable, most successful legion, the template all others would be measured against. More sons were found in rapid succession. Layman Russ on the frozen death world of Fenris, raised by wolves, turned feral and savage. Ferrus Manus on Medusa, his hands replaced by living metal after battling a metallic worm. Fulgrim on Chemos, a world so resource-starved that his arrival had literally saved it from extinction. Each son brought their own culture, their own methods, their own deeply ingrained personalities, shaped by the worlds that had raised them. The Emperor studied each one, measuring how far they had drifted from his original design. Malcador watched these reunions with growing concern. The Primarchs were not the unified force the Emperor had envisioned. They were individuals, often at odds with each other, sometimes openly hostile. Lemon Russ despised Magnus before they ever met, sensing the Thousand Sons Primarch's psychic power and naming it witchcraft. Fulgrim pursued perfection with an intensity that bordered on obsession. And Horus, perfect Horus, carried the weight of being first found, the responsibility of living up to the Emperor's expectations. The War Council formed around the recovered Primarchs. Each son was given command of their legion, granted autonomy to wage the crusade as they saw fit. Compliance came in many forms. Guilliman brought worlds into the Imperium through diplomacy and efficient administration. Perturabo conquered through siege warfare and mathematical precision. Angron, found on Nuceria already half mad with rage, knew only slaughter. The Emperor allowed this diversity, believing that different methods would be needed for different worlds, but he was building an empire on foundations that had already begun to crack. The Mechanicum's forges worked ceaselessly, producing the weapons and ships that fueled the expansion. Entire forge worlds were devoted to space marine equipment. Mars itself became one vast factory, its surface covered in manufactorums that stretched horizon to horizon. The alliance with the tech priests was bearing fruit, but it came at a cost. The Mechanicum saw technology as sacred. The Emperor saw it as a tool. That fundamental philosophical divide was papered over by mutual need, but never truly reconciled. And in the Imperial dungeon, hidden from all but a trusted few, the Webway project consumed more of the Emperor's attention. He spent days, sometimes weeks, locked away in psychic communion with the half-built portal. The energies involved were staggering, requiring his constant supervision to prevent catastrophic failure. Malcador began to suspect the truth. The Emperor was spreading himself too thin. He could not personally lead the crusade, manage the Imperium, find his sons, and build the webway simultaneously. Something would have to give. 2 centuries into the Great Crusade, the Imperium had expanded beyond even the Emperor's most optimistic projections. Thousands of worlds had been brought into compliance. Humanity's domain stretched across the galaxy in a widening spiral. The Space Marine legions had become legendary, their Primarchs elevated to myths, even among their own warriors. But beneath the golden veneer of success, rot was spreading. Orgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, had always been different. Found on Colchis, he had been raised in a culture steeped in religious tradition. Where other Primarchs saw the Emperor as a brilliant leader or a mighty warrior, Lorgar saw divinity incarnate. He wrote prayers to the Emperor. He built cathedrals in his name. He brought worlds into compliance, not through war, but through faith, converting populations to worship the god Emperor of mankind. The Emperor tolerated this at first. Compliance was compliance, regardless of method. But as the Word-Bearers' crusade slowed to a crawl, as Lorgar spent months converting single worlds while other legions conquered dozens, frustration grew. The Emperor dispatched emissaries ordering Lorgar to increase his pace. The Primarch complied, but his methods remained unchanged. Faith before speed, devotion before efficiency. Then came Mongarchia, the perfect city. Lorgar's masterwork, a monument of faith built on Kur, a world the Word-Bearers had brought into compliance decades earlier. Every building a temple, every citizen a believer. It was everything Lorgar dreamed the Imperium could become, a civilization united not by force, but by shared worship of the Emperor. He invited his father to witness this achievement, to see what faith could accomplish. The Emperor's response shattered Lorgar's soul. Guilliman's Ultramarines arrived in orbit with orders that made even the pragmatic Lord of Macragge hesitate. Monarchia was to be destroyed. Not conquered, not reclaimed, but annihilated as an example. The entire Word-Bearers Legion was forced to kneel in the ruins while the Emperor himself, projected as a psychic avatar, denounced Lorgar's faith as weakness. Humanity needed no gods. The Emperor was not divine. Worship was slavery, and Lorgar had enslaved billions. What the Emperor failed to see in that moment was the despair in his son's eyes. Lorgar's entire worldview had been built on the foundation of the Emperor's divinity. To be told that foundation was false, that everything he had done was wrong, broke something fundamental in the Primarch. He knelt in the ashes of his perfect city and felt a void open inside him. And into that void, something else whispered, something that promised the truth the Emperor had denied him. Magnus the Red presented a different kind of problem. The Primarch of the Thousand Sons was perhaps the most powerful psyker among the Emperor's sons, second only to the Emperor himself. He had been found on Prospero, a world that had turned psychic enlightenment into high art. Magnus saw the warp not as a danger, but as a tool, infinite in its potential, if only one had the knowledge and will to control it. The Emperor watched his red-skinned son delve deeper into sorcery, with growing alarm. Other Primarchs shared this concern, but for different reasons. Mortarion, raised on a world ruled by psychic tyrants, despised all witchcraft on principle. Layman Russ saw Magnus's practices as violations of natural law. The divide between the legions grew, those who employed librarians, psychic specialists within their ranks, and those who viewed all warp manipulation as corruption. The Emperor found himself mediating disputes between his sons, trying to hold together an alliance that had never truly been unified. Reports of chaos corruption reached Terra with increasing frequency. Not all came from Xenos worlds, some came from human populations, even from Imperial army regiments. soldiers driven mad by whispers in their dreams, officers making pacts with entities they did not understand. The Emperor suppressed these reports, classified them beyond even most Primarchs' access. To admit that chaos could corrupt humanity was to admit that the Imperial truth might not be enough protection. And in the webway, disaster loomed. The portal was nearly complete, but its stability required constant psychic reinforcement. The Emperor spent more time in the Imperial dungeon than on the surface. His physical presence in the Crusade diminished. Meetings with his sons became rare. Some Primarchs went years without seeing their father. Into that absence, resentment grew. They had been scattered as infants, denied their birthright, and now that they had been found, the Emperor was withdrawing again, focused on some secret project he would not explain even to his most trusted sons. The Council of Nicaea was meant to settle the question of psychic powers within the legions once and for all. The Emperor summoned his sons to the world of Nicaea, along with representatives from every legion, Imperial army commanders, and members of the War Council. The chamber was vast, built to accommodate thousands. At its center, a raised platform where the Emperor himself would sit in judgment. The debate began civilly enough. Magnus stood as the primary advocate for psychic enlightenment. He argued that the warp was a natural force, like gravity or electromagnetism, that could be studied and controlled. The Thousand Sons had developed strict protocols, mental disciplines that prevented possession or corruption. To abandon psychic powers was to cripple humanity, to reject a fundamental aspect of their evolution. His words were eloquent, backed by demonstrations that awed many present. Mortarion countered with the voice of bitter experience. He had seen what psychic tyrants could do, how they enslaved populations with their minds. Every psyker was a potential gateway for daemons, no matter how disciplined they claimed to be. The Death Guard Primarch's argument was simple and brutal. Kill all psykers, including the librarians within the legions, and eliminate the threat at its source. His words found support among those Primarchs who distrusted the warp on principle. Layman Russ added his voice, though his position was more nuanced. The Space Wolves employed rune priests, shamanic psykers who drew power from Fenris itself. These were not witches, Russ claimed, but sacred traditions older than the Imperium. The distinction was thin, and Magnus was quick to point out the hypocrisy. Either psychic powers were acceptable, or they were not. Russ could not have it both ways. The Wolf King's response was to bare his teeth and promise they would settle the matter later, personally. For days, the debate raged. Arguments became heated. Ancient grudges surfaced. The Emperor watched in silence, his golden face unreadable. Those present would later recall the weight of his gaze, the sense that every word spoken was being measured against some internal calculation none of them could perceive. And perhaps that was when some of the Primarchs began to truly doubt, had their father already made his decision? Was this entire council merely theater? When the Emperor finally spoke, his words carried the force of absolute law. The Librarius was disbanded. All psychic practices within the legions, save for navigators and astropaths essential for travel and communication, were forbidden. The Edict of Nicaea declared that humanity was not ready to wield such powers safely until the webway was complete. Until humanity no longer depended on the warp for travel, psychic disciplines represented an unacceptable risk. Magnus felt the words like physical blows. Everything he had built, every student he had trained, every secret of the warp he had unlocked, declared illegal with a single pronouncement. He had come to Nicaea expecting his father's support, or at least understanding. Instead, he was rebuked, his life's work dismissed. The Emperor's reasoning was sound from a certain perspective, but Magnus saw only rejection, another father figure, like the one on Prospero, who feared what he could not control. What none of them knew, what the Emperor could not tell them, was the true reason for the edict. The Webway project was at a critical juncture. Any significant warp disturbance could damage the still fragile portal mechanisms. Magnus's psychic experiments, particularly his attempts to pierce the veil and explore deeper parts of the Imperium, were creating ripples the Emperor could sense. The edict was not about mistrust of psychic powers. It was about protecting the secret project that would make those powers unnecessary. But by keeping his reasons hidden, the Emperor drove the wedge deeper. As the council dispersed, the Emperor made another announcement that shook the assembled Primarchs. He was returning to Terra permanently. The Great Crusade would continue under new leadership. Horus, first found and most beloved, would be named War Master, given supreme command of the Crusade and authority over all his brothers. The Emperor's work on Terra could no longer be delayed. The Imperium's future depended on the completion of his secret project. The Primarchs reacted with shock, confusion, and in some cases barely concealed hurt. They had conquered the galaxy for their father, and now he was abandoning them at the moment of victory. Horus tried to appear honored by the promotion, but even he felt the burden of it. The other Primarchs would resent serving under one of their own, and the Emperor, the unifying force that held them together despite their differences, would be absent. The whisper that had been growing since Monarchia, since Nicaea, became a shout. The Emperor did not trust them. He saw them as tools, not sons, and tools could be discarded when they were no longer needed. And in the Imperium, the dark gods smiled. The seeds planted at the Primarchs' scattering had taken root at last. Lorgar's faith had been shattered, leaving him desperate for new gods to worship. Magnus's pride had been wounded. His certainty that he knew better than his father crystallized into defiance. Horus had been given an impossible task, set up to fail under the weight of his brother's jealousy. The pieces were in place. All that remained was to knock them over and watch the Imperium burn. The Emperor returned to Terra and sealed himself within the Imperial dungeon. What followed would be 10,000 years of absolute torment, though in those first moments he believed victory was within reach. The webway portal stood complete, its mechanisms humming with power that bridged technology and psychic force in ways that defied both. He sat upon the golden throne, a device that would amplify his consciousness and allow him to maintain the portal's stability while simultaneously projecting his awareness across the galaxy. But Magnus, bitter and desperate to prove his worth, had made a catastrophic decision. Warned by the Chaos gods of a supposed threat to the Emperor, deceived into believing he was saving his father, Magnus performed a ritual of such psychic magnitude that it tore through the warp like a spear through parchment. His warning reached Terra, but the psychic shockwave that carried it shattered every ward the Emperor had placed around the webway portal. Daemons poured through the breach immediately, flooding into the Imperial dungeon, threatening to turn Terra itself into a daemon world. The Emperor had no choice. He could not leave the throne. If he did, the portal would collapse entirely, and the demonic incursion would consume the planet. He was forced to fight a war on two fronts, maintaining the portal's integrity with one portion of his mind, while battling endless hordes of warp entities with another. The Adeptus Custodes, his personal guard, fought beside him in the dungeon's depths, dying in their thousands to hold back the tide. The war that should have been fought across the stars was now being waged in the Emperor's own basement, and he could not even warn his sons of what was coming. Because by the time Magnus shattered the webway, Horus had already fallen. On Davin, corrupted by the chaos blade of the traitor Eugen Temba, the War Master had been shown visions of a future where the Emperor sat as a god while his sons were forgotten. The visions were lies, carefully crafted by chaos, but they fed every doubt, every resentment Horus had suppressed. When he awoke from his fever, he was changed. The greatest of all humanity's champions had become its doom, exactly as the Whispers had always promised. The Horus heresy erupted across the galaxy. Half the legions turned traitor, some through corruption, others through loyalty to their Primarchs who had been deceived. Brother fought brother. Worlds that had stood for centuries burned in hours. The Imperium, which had seemed invincible, revealed itself to be fragile, held together only by the Emperor's will and the bonds between his sons. With the Emperor trapped and those bonds shattered, everything collapsed. Terra itself came under siege. Horus brought his traitor legions to humanity's birthworld, determined to kill his father and claim the Imperium for the Chaos Gods. The Emperor could not leave the Golden Throne, could not lead the defense, could barely spare the psychic energy to coordinate with Dawn and Sanguinius, who commanded the Loyalists. For weeks, the siege ground on, traitors pushing deeper into the Imperial Palace, getting closer to the throne room, where their ultimate prize waited, helpless. When Horus finally lowered his shields, when the Emperor teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit with Dawn and Sanguinius for the final confrontation, he already knew how it would end. Sanguinius, the most noble of his sons, would die trying to wound Horus, to weaken him enough for the Emperor to succeed, and the Emperor would be forced to destroy his most beloved son completely, erasing Horus's soul so thoroughly that even the Chaos Gods could not resurrect him. The cost would be everything. The battle lasted seconds but felt like eternities. Horus, empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods, nearly killed his father. The Emperor, weakened by centuries on the throne, struggling to hold back demons with half his mind, could not match his son's corrupted strength. But in one moment, one brief instant when Horus hesitated, the Emperor struck with all the power he had left. The psychic attack did not just kill Horus, it annihilated him, erased every fragment of his soul from existence, and nearly destroyed the Emperor in the process. Rogol Dawn found his father moments later, a broken shell of what he had been. The Emperor's body was shattered beyond any hope of healing, but he could not be allowed to die. His psychic presence was the only thing keeping the Astronomicon lit, the psychic lighthouse that allowed navigators to guide ships through the warp. Without it, the Imperium would be isolated again, every world cut off, humanity doomed to extinction. So they placed him back on the Golden Throne, now his prison as much as his seat of power, and watched as their father became something neither alive nor dead. 10,000 psychers are sacrificed daily to sustain him. Their souls are fed into the Golden Throne's mechanisms, burned away to provide the psychic energy that keeps the Emperor's consciousness anchored to reality. It is a holocaust, repeated every single day, and it is the only thing preventing humanity's extinction. The Emperor, who sought to free humanity from the tyranny of gods and superstition, had become the most demanding god of all, requiring literal human sacrifice to maintain his existence. The Imperium he built has become everything he fought against. The imperial truth is dead, replaced by the imperial cult that worships him as the god emperor, despite his denial of divinity. Innovation is heresy, stagnation is doctrine. The very idea of human advancement, the dream of psychic ascension and freedom from the warp, has been abandoned in favor of brutal survival. His plan to save humanity trapped them in an eternity of war, suffering, and ignorance. And yet, he endures. Some say his consciousness is scattered across the warp, fragmented into a billion pieces, each one fighting to protect humanity from demonic predation. Others believe he is fully aware, trapped in his rotting body, experiencing every moment of agony for 10,000 years with no hope of release. Perhaps the truth is worse. Perhaps he sees everything his Imperium has become, understands that his every effort brought about the exact opposite of his intentions, and can do nothing but watch as humanity slowly dies in his name. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy was a shadow of its former glory. Half the Space Marine legions were dead or traitor. The Emperor, for all intents and purposes, was gone, locked in an eternal battle that left him no capacity to lead. Malcador the Sigillite had died activating the Golden Throne's mechanisms, his ancient soul finally burning out after serving the Emperor for thousands of years. The High Lords of Terra, bureaucrats and administrators, found themselves leading an empire that spanned the galaxy with no real idea of the Emperor's grand design. The remaining Primarchs struggled with the new reality. Guilliman attempted to codify everything into law, creating the Codex Astartes to prevent any single legion from having the power to threaten the Imperium again. The legions were broken into chapters, each one independent, each one limited to 1,000 warriors. It was pragmatic, sensible even, but it went against everything the Emperor had designed. The Primarchs were meant to lead vast armies, not scattered companies. One by one, the loyal Primarchs vanished. Some died in battle, others simply disappeared, last seen walking into the wilderness or departing on ships that never returned. Perhaps they could not bear the Imperium without their father. Perhaps they saw what it was becoming and chose exile over participation. Guilliman was struck down and placed in stasis, neither dead nor truly alive, mirroring his father's own fate. The lion was betrayed and fell into a coma within the rock. Leman Russ vanished into the warp, searching for a way to heal the Emperor. Each departure left the Imperium weaker, more dependent on institutions rather than heroes. The Adeptus Ministorum rose to power, building churches on every world, preaching the divinity of the Emperor, despite every word he had ever spoken against worship. They had evidence that seemed irrefutable. He performed miracles. He had lived for thousands of years. He sat upon a golden throne, and his will alone held back the darkness. If that was not a god, what was? The priests did not care about the Emperor's intentions. They cared about the faith that united 1 billion worlds, the belief that gave humans the strength to fight and die in the Emperor's name. Knowledge became heresy. The standard template constructs, those repositories of human achievement, were lost or destroyed. The Mechanicum hoarded what little remained, doling out technology like sacraments, ensuring no world could become independent. Innovation was dangerous, creativity suspect. Any deviation from established patterns might be chaos corruption. The Imperium that had once reached for the stars now cowered behind walls, both literal and metaphorical, terrified of change. Yet humanity endured, not because of wise leadership or technological advancement, but through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. 1 trillion souls scattered across 1 million worlds, most of whom would never see Terra, never know the true history of their species, yet who fought and died believing the Emperor watched over them. It was a lie built on a tragedy, built on a failed dream. But it kept humanity alive when any rational species would have fallen. The traitor Primarchs became demon princes, eternal servants of the Chaos gods, leading their corrupted legions in endless wars against their former brothers. They were granted immortality of a sort, but it was the immortality of damnation, forever changed into something monstrous, forever enslaved to powers they once thought they could control. They had sought to escape the Emperor's dominance, only to become puppets of far more cruel masters. And in the warp, the Emperor's fragmented consciousness continued its silent war. Some claimed to see him in their dreams, a golden figure fighting back legions of daemons. Others said they heard his voice in moments of desperation, granting them strength to survive impossible odds. The living saints, individuals who manifested impossible powers in the Emperor's name, suggested that some part of him remained active, aware, capable of intervening in limited ways. But whether these were truly the Emperor's actions or merely humanity's desperate need to believe he still watched over them, none could say with certainty. The great irony was this: the Emperor had sought to free humanity from gods, and in failing, became the most powerful god in the galaxy. He had sought to advance humanity towards psychic ascension, and in failing, trapped them in superstitious ignorance. He had sought to unite humanity under reason, and in failing, gave them faith. Every goal he pursued had led to its opposite, as if the universe itself was mocking his ambitions. And trapped on the golden throne, aware or not, he would experience the consequences of these failures for eternity. 10,000 years have passed since the Emperor took his throne. The galaxy grinds on, wars flaring and dying like sparks in the void. New threats emerge constantly. The Tyranids devour worlds, the Necrons awaken from their ancient slumber, chaos continues its eternal assault. yet humanity persists, not through strength or wisdom, but through the simple refusal to accept extinction. On Terra, in the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne hums with the sound of dying psykers. Their screams are filtered through machinery older than most civilizations, transformed into the psychic energy that keeps the Astronomicon burning. It is the most horrific sound imaginable, and it never stops. The Adeptus Custodes stand eternal vigil, their golden armor reflecting the light of the throne, their faces hidden behind masks that show no emotion. They have stood this watch for 10 millennia, and they will stand it for 10,000 more if needed. Above Terra, pilgrims arrive by the millions. They come from across the galaxy, spending their life savings for one chance to stand in the throne room, to feel the presence of the God Emperor, to receive what they believe is his blessing. Most die before reaching Terra, the journey too long, the ships too crowded. Those who survive often die in the crush of bodies around the palace gates. But still they come, generation after generation, drawn by faith in a being who denied divinity with his every word. The Imperium continues to expand, though whether this is growth or simply the thrashing of a dying beast, none can say. New worlds are discovered and brought into compliance. The methods differ little from those used during the Great Crusade. Submit or die, accept the Emperor's rule, or face annihilation. The brutality is justified as necessary, the cruelty excused as pragmatic. It is what the Emperor would have wanted, the priests say, though the Emperor wanted nothing of the sort. Yet there are whispers of change. Across the galaxy, in hidden corners far from Terra's light, some claim the Emperor is stirring. The Astronomicon burns brighter than it has in centuries. Phenomena occur that cannot be explained, as if reality itself is holding its breath. The Primarchs, those who vanished, may be returning. Guilliman has awakened, walking once more among his people, horrified by what the Imperium has become, but determined to save it nonetheless. Perhaps others will follow. Perhaps the Emperor's story is not yet finished. In the depths of the Golden Throne, surrounded by machinery that groans with the weight of millennia, the Emperor's body sits in state. Flesh that should have turned to dust millennia ago is preserved through psychic will and technological miracle. His eyes, if they can still be called eyes, stare sightlessly at nothing. Or perhaps they see everything, the entire Imperium laid bare before a consciousness that spans the galaxy. If he suffers, he gives no sign. If he dreams, none can know of what. The mysteries of Warhammer 40,000 are vast, stretching back before human memory and forward into a future that grows darker with each passing day. But at the heart of them all is this one truth. The Emperor of mankind sought to save humanity, and in doing so, became its eternal prisoner. Whether that sacrifice was worth the cost, whether humanity deserves the price he paid, these are questions that have no answers. There is only the grinding reality of survival, the endless war, and the dim hope that somewhere, somehow, the Emperor's plan might still come to fruition. So rest now, knowing that across the galaxy, 1 trillion souls fight in the Emperor's name, whether he wanted their worship or not. The story continues, as it always has, as perhaps it always will. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the origins of the God Emperor, remember to subscribe for more explorations into the hidden mysteries of Warhammer 40,000 and beyond. Until next time, sleep well, and know that the Emperor, in whatever form he now exists, protects,